Okay, welcome everybody. I'm Anthony Guida. I'm president of Friends of Architecture Santa Fe, and I would like to welcome you all to Revisioning Planning. This is part of the Revisioning History series put on by Friends of Architecture Santa Fe. It features leading community voices and the public in discussion about the future of our shared built environment in Santa Fe by way of critically re-examining the methods that our city has used to make plans for the future historically. A little confusing, but we're looking back to look forward. Revisioning planning is the first of our 4 in-depth sessions in 2020 for the series. Other sessions coming up are preservation, housing, and sustainability, and maybe a few more in 2021. AIA members will earn 2 HSW learning units tonight. A little bit about Friends. Our mission is to provide or to create informed and inclusive conversations about design and the built environment towards a more vibrant, equitable, and sustainable Santa Fe. We're an independent nonprofit group with an all-volunteer board, and most importantly, an all-volunteer group of presenters. A tremendous amount of time and work goes into producing quality content for our events, and we're incredibly appreciative for everybody who joins us in these events. If you enjoy our programs, and that includes our panel discussions like we have tonight, our design charrettes, Pecha Kucha, our architecture tours, I strongly encourage you to please volunteer. Please volunteer to be a part of the discussion. And please support us financially. You can donate to Friends of Architecture Santa Fe on our website, architecturesantafe.org. A few housekeeping things about tonight's session. This is 120 minutes or 2 hours total. The first half of our session tonight will be a series of 10 to 12-minute presentations by our speakers. And the second half will be a moderated panel discussion with interactive audience Q&A. Just a few ground rules. I think everybody will be coming in with their microphones muted and their cameras off. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen to submit questions for the panelists. There's also a chat button if you have any technical issues, but the Q&A is the primary method for you to participate in the conversation and to ask questions. We hope to get to all of them in our discussion tonight. I would encourage everybody to start submitting questions during the presentations, during the first hour. And if you have a question that's aimed at a particular panelist or directed at some content that a particular person has presented, please include that in your question. I think Zoom allows you the opportunity to submit questions anonymously, but we would love to have your name, and we will certainly indicate who the question is coming from, and that would be helpful for the conversation in case we have to follow up or ask you to clarify further. We're trying to make these as interactive as possible in the time of the pandemic, so please use that Q&A button. I am now going to introduce our board member and treasurer, Gayla Bechtel. Gayla is an architect and urban designer and principal of Gayla Bechtel Architect. She's, as I said, a board member and our lead for the Revisioning History series. Gayla will be introducing tonight's topic, revisioning planning, as well as our speakers tonight. Please take it away, Gayla.
Okay, thanks, Anthony. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Revisioning Planning. So tonight we have the opportunity to be with you and 4 incredible advocates and thinkers to talk about planning and why it matters in Santa Fe. I'll start by reflecting on a part of town that we all know. At the intersection of St. Francis and Cordova, there are 2 grocery stores, established restaurants, shops, and employment and residential neighborhoods, as well as new housing under construction, nearby bike paths, and even a station for regional transit lines. All of the ingredients for an ideal village center are there, and yet there is no center, there's no connection, and most notably, no pedestrian environment of any quality. As at the nearby intersection with Cerrillos Road, the goal of this physical environment is to enable the diversion of cars into parking lots and usher cars through the crossing as fast and as efficiently as possible. But this could be so different and so much better. And another example, large new apartment complexes are moving forward along Agua Fria, Richards Road, South Meadows, and behind Santa Fe Place. Although they are achieving higher densities and reducing a tremendous shortfall of housing units, these developments are driven less by the types of homes, amenities, and neighborhoods people actually want, and far more by low land cost, lower risk, and potentially high profit for developers. And in many cases, the city itself is building the infrastructure that enables these developments to happen. Why should it be that the form of needed development is dictated so heavily by market forces at the expense of quality, connection to place, and community? Again, we know it could be so much better. So why planning? Why do we plan our cities? A short and relatively textbook answer is to ensure the public's health, safety, and welfare. You might hear those terms a lot. So we do this by providing orderly direction while anticipating and providing for future needs through land use and design standards. But there's more to it. Over the last century, many cities have exercised greater self-determination in how they plan. Cities are dynamic in their demographics, in their economies, and in their goals, their values, and their ambitions. For instance, a city might like to reduce its dependence on fossil fuels, reduce carbon emissions, and create greater equity by encouraging compact development over sprawl, increasing the access to community services and amenities, and investing in multimodal transportation instead of private automobiles. Or they may anticipate changes to regional and national economies. Or they may anticipate the impacts of climate change on their city, such as gradual warming, sea level rise, not an issue here, and reduce access to water. Or they may want to address the very real racial, ethnic inequalities inherent in who can afford to live where. Cities and communities can plan based on these values and in anticipation of these challenges, and in turn develop laws and policy for implementation. So over the years, the city of Santa Fe has created brilliant plans, and we'll see some of those tonight. For the last 20, we have not made very much progress towards a cohesive future vision. We are not succeeding. We are still operating from the 1990s general plan. But this is our problem. We have stated values, but that don't result in a built environment that reflects those values. So why are studies commissioned and then put on the shelf? Are they still relevant, in whole or in part? Who has the influence and who affects this change? Basically, how do we get the city we want? We know change is happening. How do values of diversity, equity, and sustainability inform planning? What about inclusive preservation and representation? Building places that make communities and institutions more connected and more resilient. In the context of this current moment, how can we be inclusive and really ask ourselves for whom are we planning? As an alternative to planning commission and city council hearings, how can we create the space and the processes for open and inclusive conversations to take place? To listen, to examine, to envision the future together strategically and deliberately. So tonight, we're hoping to build capacity for that conversation. As we'll see, planning is an imperfect art. There is no crystal ball, and there can be no ideal or perfect plan. This is not meant to be discouraging, quite the opposite. As a community, we have in this process the incredible opportunity to self-reflect, to critically examine, to creatively imagine, to propose informed solutions, to test those results, and to periodically adjust for better outcomes. We can make a difference if we engage with openness and the willingness to listen and learn from each other. Okay, so let's go on with the evening. Our panelists have selected documents tonight that help establish important themes and an understanding of how Santa Fe has historically planned for its future. Each panelist will use these documents as a launching pad for providing their perspective on contemporary planning concerns and offer ways that we might think about next steps. This will be followed by a moderated discussion by Lisa Roach, an archaeologist and community-based preservation planner by training and currently manages the city's Historic Preservation Division. This Q&A is open, and after our panelists have set the stage tonight, the discussion following might be the most important part of the evening and the most actionable. We might begin to lay out a roadmap for what we can do next for our city. So first up is Subi Bowden. She will reflect on, she will reflect on the values guiding and creating and approving plan developments. She highlights recommendations from studies that are relevant to solving our challenges today. Subi is an architect, planner, performer, and artist. She leads Architecture and Design Studio, SBA, and is honored to have worked with the citizens of Santa Fe since 1984. Her practice values community participation, humor, collaboration, and the preservation of our natural environment while pursuing affordability, the appropriate use of technology, quality, and elegance in design. Subi's planning background includes participation in the Santa Fe Land Use Resource Center, the early Hillside Protection Ordinance, water resource guidebooks, and Santa Fe's countywide affordable housing study, and 36 years of fun and planning in the Santa Fe Rail Yard. So Subi, take it away.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Subi, and tonight we're going to be talking about affordable housing and housing developments in the city of Santa Fe. The city currently in 2019 had 5,000 homeless people. Obviously after COVID-19, that number is dramatically risen. And this is people living under dining room tables, sleeping on sofas, out in the fields, under highway situations. So in the past, Santa Fe was able to go in their backyard and dig adobes and build their units. Starting in the 1960s, mobile homes became affordable housing throughout Santa Fe and Santa Fe County. And our future now is looking at stacked units. You think of something like Zocalo, or last night on the slideshow with Midtown, they were showing stacked units. In 1999, the city approved a 20-year plan, which we're required to do every 20 years. So again, we're at a point today where we should be getting the next 20-year plan. The goals at that time were to spread to the south and to the west, and dominantly to the south. In the lower yellow box, you'll see Tierra Contenta. And the main pushback from the south side was that all of the affordable housing was being pushed south. So the city decided to look up at the bright yellow box in the top, the northwest quadrant, and the red is the downtown area. This is the latest phase of Tierra Contenta. Tierra Contenta currently has 2,300 homes that have been built in the last 25 years. They built Swan Park, and it's surrounded by Airport Road with, as you can see here, this is a photo we took off the satellite just the other day, dominantly big box and very difficult to cross the Airport Road in these conditions. The northwest quadrant, land that had been there for 400 years, was basically developed with Claudia Horn with Design Workshop, with our office. And we purposely structured Northwest Quadrant to teach citizens about planning and about housing. And so people were selected from the south side, the north side. There were developers, there were activists, teenagers, there were NIMBYs, there was city staff all working together. And the goal was to teach these citizens about how to develop the Northwest Quadrant. You'll see here in red, the Northwest Quadrant abuts 599 to the north, and it abuts Casa Solana to the south. And when we started talking to neighborhoods about development, we basically picked neighborhoods that surround the Northwest Quadrant. We picked Zocalo, Casa Solana, the West San Francisco, East Side, and then we showed examples of each of these developments so that people could see that Casa Solana was 3.7 units and Zocalo was at 7.3 to 14 units. And when people realized that these densities were the neighborhoods they've been walking through for most of their time in Santa Fe, they felt much more comfortable with higher densities. These are images of the hillside, and the intent was to, by using higher densities, to go for a hill town modeling. We looked at architecture and urban form. On the left column, you'll see the traditional pitched roof buildings, and on the right, you'll see the traditional Pueblo style. And the intention is that if you're abutting an existing neighborhood, you use traditional styling in the northwest quadrant. And as you move up to the top of the hill, you can be very contemporary in both territorial and Pueblo styling. We also looked at street studies that were downtown for Don Gaspar and Marcy and Montezuma. We also started working with the 55 citizens to teach them the plans in red are the downtown and the plaza right underneath that northwest quadrant. And then we showed them the kind of density that when you're looking at 12 to 29 units, you're looking at the downtown buildings around the plaza as well as more contemporary features. We also showed them in that same kind of formatting other neighborhoods and other communities that were 12 to 29 units per acre, and 7 to 12 on the left, with Casa Solana and West San Francisco being part of that, and then the neighborhood 3 to 7 on the right. And so as the citizens in this participation understood that we were talking about densities that they were accustomed to, they agreed to much higher densities than the conversation began. On the left is a map of colors so that when you're abutting existing, you're in muted tones of browns and pale greens. As you move up to the top, it becomes more colorful. And also as you move up, it becomes taller in form to where you're up to 4 stories tall at the top of the hill. At the same time that the city was looking at the northwest quadrant, the county was looking county-wide, and the county stretches from Albuquerque in the lower left-hand corner through Santa Fe, what's called El Centro, and all the way up to Espanola. And the county put a call out for anyone who is interested in offering their land for building affordable housing. And 54 sites were submitted and studied and analyzed. And that report still exists at the county, looking at utilities, proximity to transportation, school districts, were utilities on site, was it a hilly site, was it a flat site? This is one of the studies that was done by Santa Fe County, which is the public works site over at St. Francis near Rodeo and the train station. And the intention was to do passive solar housing, some of which was market value, and it went all the way to affordability. And there were playgrounds, laundromats, and you walk across the street to grocery stores. The county also did a very interesting magazine called Homework Magazine. And the purpose of Homework Magazine was, again, to teach citizens and to distribute the magazine county-wide in order that they could better understand what they could do to participate in affordability. And so towards that, the Homework Magazine studied many different aspects. One, for instance, was time and money. There were over 100 funding sources listed for different types of funding, whether it was single family, whether it was remodel, whether it was new housing, Native American housing, and provided access to those funding sources. This was one of the most important documents, what we affectionately refer to as the E=MC² for how you do an affordable house. And we found that by talking with both developers and with builders, financiers, that essentially the colors in the red are reduced values. You reduce the value of the land, you reduce the home size, you reduce the construction cost, and most importantly, you reduce the time that it takes to get it through the planning process and the construction process. And then if the red list of reduced items do not add up to an affordable house, then you add increased values, one of which is increased density, more homes per acre. You increase more sales of market homes to offset the cost of affordable homes, and then you provide subsidies. And the last item that you want to increase is you want to retain as many of these homes in the affordable range as possible, so that when they resell to the next generation or the next buyer, they remain affordable in the community. That requires an attachment to the mortgage to do that. And then these were all the other subjects that also were in the Homework magazine, covering a wide range of issues. The images on the left were some of the affordable housing units that were designed by local architects. On the right, there was a many-page community directory that listed what kind of housing you might be looking at, and how to access those people and the phone numbers at that time. And last but not least, I'm going to go back to the 5,000 homeless. We're in a moment now where we, obviously by COVID, will be struck even more deeply by the lack of funds, and our homeless count, people with homes, are continuing to rise. The Northwest Quadrant is for sale right now, and they've been telling developers that there's no plan attached, but in fact, the Northwest Quadrant is built into the general plan. We're doing Midtown, we're doing phase 3 of Tierra Contenta. It's a moment in which we as a community can gather together and participate in helping our citizens occupy more and more affordable homes. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Subi. It's just so great to see such brilliant work over the years. And so we had Subi go first, really because we wanted her to show the brilliant work that we've done in the city and that's possible. That is community participation based and design based. And so we're really excited about that. So thank you. Okay, so Miguel, if you would please share your screen. I'll introduce you. This is Miguel Acosta. He will be talking about the importance of designing a community planning process that ensures the underrepresented voices are recognized for equitable community engagement and sustainable communities. Miguel is the co-director of Earth Care, a multi-generational community leadership organization in Santa Fe, where his current focus is propelling Santa Fe Mutual Aid, excuse me, just want to make sure I've got this correct. Santa Fe Mutual Aid, a collective of organizations that have responded to COVID-19 pandemic. Miguel brings more than 45 years of experience in advocating for educational opportunities and sustainable community development for underserved populations. He has been the director of El Colegio Sin Fronteras, excuse my accent, I have to get better, a principal associate at the Center for Relational Learning and a community health promoter with the New Mexico Department of Health, a program developer at UNM, and has served on the Board of Education of Albuquerque Public Schools. Miguel's family originated in Jalisco, Mexico, and migrated to Chicago in 1919. He studied urban planning and community development at the University of Illinois in Chicago and at the University of New Mexico, and we are so happy he's here. So take it away, Miguel. Thank you.
Sorry, can you hear me? So I want to thank everybody for this opportunity to share some information and some perspectives on areas of the city that don't get as much attention as the plaza and the streets leading to the plaza. I'm looking at an area of the south side that's basically the annexed area of the south side. So if you look at this map, these were areas that were annexed by the city at different points in the last, I think, 20 years, 15 years. When folks normally talk about the south side, what they're talking about is Tierra Contenta. That's sort of the image that people have. And this area had been annexed from the beginning. That was part of the development plan for the master plan community. The areas that I focus, and it also has had, as was mentioned, more affordable housing as a percentage of the housing units down there than other parts of the city. The areas 4 and 5, those annexed areas, those are the ones where we do the majority of our work. And these are areas that are primarily populated by a very important labor sector here in Santa Fe, which is primarily immigrant laborers, families and children. And it's the most populated part of the South Side, even though you wouldn't know that by where the services are and the schools are located. So areas, you know, along Airport Road, there's all these areas here are primarily trailer parks. That was mentioned also. A lot of these areas are being converted. A lot of the empty land along in here, and some of the trailer parks are being converted to new housing, which ironically may bring services to the community, but not to the community that's there now, but to the community that's moving there. If you look at this map here, this gives us an indication. And in the north of Airport Road, you see the youth shelter. The youth shelter, one school, Ramirez Thomas, and then the newer school at Camino Real, which is really kind of away from the rest of the population there. So this area up here, very few resources, very few services. The plan, the Southwest Santa Fe Community Area Plan, looked at all of this area as it was being annexed, and it had some very good ideas for how to develop healthy, sustainable, family-centered communities. These were some of the premises of that community vision that was developed. And by the way, there was very little participation, if any, from the Spanish-speaking population, from the immigrant population, in developing this plan. When I moved to Santa Fe in 2007, that was one of my questions to the city councilors back then and to the county commission. Hello?
We can hear you, Miguel.
Miguel, we can hear you. We're listening to you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I'm sorry. So the basic premises of the community vision, there are things that we support, but things that we have not seen materialize. In 2012, Councilor Carmichael Dominguez initiated a Southside Quality of Life engagement process, and he contracted us specifically to do engagement north of Airport Road from the populations and families that normally would not show up for these kinds of activities. But like other planning that the city, or that planners do, unfortunately, the vision was developed before there was any consultation with the community. It's not necessarily a bad vision. It was, comes from healthy communities, research and good practices, but it was something that we were responding to rather than something that we were developing ourselves. Through the process of engagement, we were able to reach about 300 families, primarily in kitchen table kinds of meetings that we had, and these are parents that were facilitating parent conversations, asking 3 basic questions about their communities. What did they like about it? What would they want to change? And what was the greatest challenge? And they also had an opportunity to list off things that they would like to, that were concerns or areas of opportunity. We, as a part of that process, we also created a Airport Road Merchants Association, who also participated in weekly and biweekly meetings, responding to the healthy community surveys, but also developing their own conversations around how to develop the business sector on the South Side. We then, and so these are the results of those conversations. 300 families, 24 small business owners, and lots of youth. They suggested that we needed more opportunities for family-oriented recreation, especially for small children and toddlers, job training and stable employment opportunities, parks with soccer facilities to engage youth and adult mentors, libraries, community gardens.
Go ahead.
And community councils that help drive development and decision making. This last fall, we were contracted by the city again to do engagement again, and this time we engaged almost 1,000 young people and families and local residents and organizations around the development of a teen center. And many of the things that had come up in previous conversations with families came up again. And we included results of previous youth summits as well. And they repeated many of the points from the quality of life, as I mentioned, but they emphasized things like the need to feel like they belong, to feel safe, to see a future for themselves here, to be have opportunities to be creative and to be able to celebrate. Of course, this was all before the pandemic and before the economic collapse. And we're in the process of engaging families again and young people again to see how they feel about going back to school, etc. But there's lots of opportunities, I think, when we do offer the opportunities and the invitations in a way that makes sense, people will show up. If we don't do that, the risks in this area are that between the new development and between the opportunity zones, the area will be gentrified, and this population will be pushed further out of the city into Española, where they're moving already, further down towards Glorieta, or any other place where they can find affordable land or affordable places to live. Thank you very much, and we'll look forward to the questions a little later.
Okay, thank you so much, Miguel. Am I on? I am. Okay, so I am so grateful that your organization is doing this kind of work. I love to belong, to feel safe, to see a future,
Sobi,
to be creative,
Carlos,
and to celebrate. I think those are really important things that we need to remember as we go forward. Okay, so now we've got Carlos. Carlos is senior land use planner, and he will demystify the often complex process of planning and regulations and the unintended ill consequences of outdated planning documents, which is sort of the major theme in some ways of our evening. So Carlos is an urban planner working to facilitate creative changes in the built environment. He currently works for the city of Santa Fe as a land use planner, where he advocates for long-range planning efforts. He is focused on big, invisible systems and transformative change, specifically in the areas of affordable housing, long-term infrastructure cost, and the effects of land use on sustainability, equity, and local businesses. Carlos studied regional community-based facilitative planning practices at Cornell University and the Evergreen State College, and has previously worked in New York and Washington State. He volunteers his time with educational nonprofits like Big Brothers, Big Sisters, and the Telluride Association. He joins Friends of Architecture Santa Fe Board this year and is in the up-and-coming Pechacucha program lead, and we are really excited to hear Carlos today. Okay, take it away, Carlos.
Hey, thank you very much. And thank you to the other speakers that are joining us. I feel very privileged to be able to join in on this conversation. So at the introduction last month, I mentioned that planning thinks spatially and that it tries to look into the future. I then proceeded to talk as quickly as I could about some of the values and difficulties of community-based planning. I noted 3 things that I think are critical to acknowledge and work through. The first is that plans only document some sort of agreement among the participants about values in the future, and that it takes constant efforts to keep them relevant. The second is that participatory planning can be exclusionary and inequitable unless we really get broad participation and think seriously about long-term time horizons. And the third is that planning concepts can be hard to engage with because they are complicated, interconnected, and chaotic systems. I'm going to put a pin in all of that today, and instead I'm going to talk about values. It is critical that plans understand and serve the values of the community, but plans are also tricky to work with. And we, as a community, must understand the difficulty and nuances that go into value-based planning. Today, my talk is going to highlight about how we can't fulfill all of our values equally because they sometimes oppose or conflict with each other. That we must figure out how to balance our different values and potentially get flexibility between them. And finally, that the community must choose which values, which regulations are top priorities, central to our future, and which values are secondary. Let me first point out the General Plan of 1999. This plan is entirely devoid of any type of visual creativity and attractiveness, but it actually has a lot of good text. It begins by highlighting some of the top priorities and concerns, and at its foundation is a list of themes or values that evolved over several years of public participation campaigns. This plan was a gigantic feat for the community and city staff. And it was the last time that Santa Fe really undertook a large, comprehensive, interdisciplinary planning effort. In the plan are multiple themes that this community still carries and cherishes today. It talks about how we want the creation of more affordable housing, about how we want to enhance our quality of life, about how we want to reduce automobile dependence and increase walkability, how we want to grow and diversify our economy, how we want to grow in environmentally sustainable ways, how we want a community-oriented downtown, how we want a mix of land uses in all areas of the city, how we want to streamline the planning and development process, and also how we want to maintain and preserve the existing sense of character. That last point is important. If we compare maintain and preserve to things like create, enhance, reduce, and streamline, we're looking at this stuff really broadly, but we have to start figuring out to what degree do we really want to preserve, protect, and maintain the status quo Santa Fe, and to what degree we want action, change, and growth. And that is one of the fundamental questions for the residents of Santa Fe. In truth, it gets a lot more complicated, a lot more nuanced. None of these are an either-or decision, and we don't have to sacrifice everything that makes Santa Fe wonderful to grow, and we don't have to exclude working families from the city in order to preserve the past. But either way, the general plan doesn't try to solve all of this. It leaves some things up to future plans and people. So I'm gonna look at another plan. This is the Highway Corridor Plan of 1999. It was drafted the same year, and yet we see a mismatch of values. So the 1999 general plan said that we should decrease our reliance on the automobile, give people priority over cars, provide a closely spaced network of narrower streets that connect neighborhoods to each other. But the highway corridor protection strategies took almost the opposite approach. It aimed for distanced, spread out, rural, automotive-centered approaches. The protection of highways, I think, is illustrated well in this image of Santa Fe. This is the center of Santa Fe. This is the population center. This is the geographic center, Cerrillos and St. Michael's. In this area, I think we see a really good analysis of how the highway corridor protection zone kind of came out. We see 3+ lanes of traffic to prioritize cars. We see landscaping that's expensive to maintain and which is only pretty if you're going faster than 35 miles an hour. We see spread out land uses with lots of parking, and we see horrid walkability. And so there's this mismatch between competing values that we say that we want. And I'm not being sarcastic when I say this, but it's perfectly okay to not value walkability. Walkability was not listed as a top priority or concern in the 1999 general plan. And just looking at the developments that have been built in the last 20 years, it has not been meaningfully prioritized. And that includes Tierra Contenta. As a public servant, I want to work with the community on whatever it values. And so I am genuinely focusing on something else. But what I'm trying to get at is that if we want walkability to be a priority, we have a lot of work to do to actually make it so. The community has to figure out what we're willing to give up. So let me switch to a big priority for Santa Fe, affordable housing. Affordable housing was a top priority in 1999. It was a top priority in 1983. It's a top priority today. But despite our efforts to work on this issue, every year the city has become less and less affordable, and it excludes more and more long-time families. Here's the deal. Less housing equals less affordability. We have not built enough housing to keep up. And so that's really this idea that if we don't actually start building and providing more housing, we will not get that affordability. And until we really understand that, we're not going to make a lot of progress on this issue. So some past plans and approaches have tried to address housing through different types of creative and complicated ways. And those are still absolutely valid, but we have to address the fundamental issue that we need more housing. This is the Santa Fe Downtown Vision Plan, and then there was another plan on housing that came before that. And in these plans, the top priority was the preservation of not just historic character, but really architectural character. That was the top priority for these plans. We see this a lot in different types of neighborhood plans and neighborhood opposition to projects, is that the preservation of character is the top priority, and that the value of housing is a secondary priority. It's deprioritized. It's only allowed if it does not create any negative impacts. So in sum, housing is only valued when it complies with the more important priorities. It's not in itself important. A good image, I think, that illustrates this on the bottom right is about how this one plan was saying that we could have more housing on second stories, but it just has to be set back so you don't see it. We could have housing as long as it's invisible. That's kind of been an approach that we've taken to housing in the past through plans and community activities. Okay, so going back to the general plan, I want to highlight that on the same page that we decided to make housing a top priority, we also documented a really powerful set of concerns that are brought up in response to almost every development project proposed. And here's how I see these concerns being expressed. Opposition to large or sprawling projects. The opposition to tall projects, especially near neighborhoods or historic districts. An opposition to dense projects or conversions of existing open space, or opposition to projects with lots of people. I'm not trying to assign any type of values here. I'm not trying to say that these are right or wrong judgments or about why or when these come up, but it creates a predicament for us. How do we reconcile the difference between our values and our priorities? How do we reconcile the difference between saying that we value something really generally, like housing, and more specifically working to achieve it and accept the consequences of that. So affordable housing is an example of something that this community says it values, but which it has not clearly supported, prioritized, or sacrificed for. And I mentioned this before, but as a facilitative planner, I don't want to say what this community should value. I don't want to say what priorities this community should have, but that's really the job of the community and your elected representatives. But I want to make sure that we really understand how these things work, understand that we have to invest in the things that we value, and understand that we have to give some things up in order to achieve what we want. So here are my questions for the Santa Fe community. Here are the discussion items that I want to have, that I hope that the community can engage more in. How do different values, priorities, strategies, and regulations, how do they affect and relate to one another? Second, what are our actual priorities? What are the actionable priorities that we have? And what are we willing to give up? What discomfort are we willing to accept? And finally, where can we be flexible with some of these? How can we use good design, good regulations, good principles, good approaches, good planning to actually accomplish multiple priorities? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carlos. Those are hard questions, and I look forward to how we as a community can answer them. It's not going to be easy, but I think it's absolutely necessary that we have a transparent conversation about how our decisions really affect what we see and how we live and how we are as in community. I think that we have, like you say, we want housing as long as it's invisible and it doesn't involve people or more cars. And I think we're over it. We have to be over it. We've got to find space for more people and preserve our character. So how can we do that? I'm excited that we're starting that conversation tonight. Okay, Andrew. Andrew Irvine is going to present design strategies for creating developments in urban districts that are healthy, happy, and resilient. So he has all the answers maybe. No, I'm kidding, Andrew. Andrew will juxtapose the 1993 and the 2017 urban studies that will reveal the gap between our intentions and actions. So Andrew Irvine brings more than 30 years in the planning industry and a knack for bringing people together to work towards a common goal and skill in leading large interdisciplinary teams. His range of projects include major infrastructure, urban renewal, public domain, and traditional park design. Fundamental to his practice of urban design is consideration of the health and happiness of the future communities. And COVID-19 has shown this to be more important than ever. Andrew has served on Building Healthy Places advisory services panels in Lamar and Colorado Springs, Colorado, and co-authored ULI, which is Urban Land Institute's 10 Principles for Building Healthy Places. He has also worked in collaboration with Charles Montgomery's Happy City Lab, integrating the principles of happiness into the planning and design of our communities. Okay, Andrew, take it away.
Thanks very much, Gayla. And hi, everyone. First disclosure, I don't come from Santa Fe. And sometimes it's good to have an external perspective, just to really, to be unweighted by politics and other things. Where I'd like to start, which is this constant reminder of the built environment is here for a long time. This is an image of the citadel in the middle of Erbil, Kurdistan in northern Iraq, who continually argue with Damascus, which is the longest continually habitated city in the world. But irrespective of whether it's 10 or 50 years, it doesn't really matter. It's 6,000 years old, and the real sort of what that does or says to me is that 240 generations have lived in this community. And so if we screw it up, we screw it up for 240 sort of communities. But also the other sort of constant reminder is that as planners, as designers of the built environment, we are also futurists. We're trying to anticipate what tomorrow looks like, what are new technologies or new expectations and other aspirations might require of us. So we need to both build deterministic outcomes as well as flexibility. So with that as a backdrop, I decided to look at two plans that came from historic Santa Fe. The first is 2003 Santa Fe Urban Design Guidelines, and then contrast that against the 2017 plan. So let's dig in and just try and understand a little about what were the drivers and what are still the common themes. When we looked at the 1993 plan, what became apparent immediately is that it was a plan that was trying to address problems, that was trying to redress the fact that we'd moved from a very tight-grained, a very walkable community into something that was starting to prioritize, as Carlos said, the automobile. And think back to the fact that in 1908, the first zoning code was established in Los Angeles, which allowed us the ability, the freedom to move that correlated with the advent of the automobile that allowed us to live over here and work over there and go to school over there and shop over there. And what happened is we started to build infrastructures that supported this freedom of movement at the consequence of walkability. And so, ultimately we ended up with a situation where we'd gone from the tight grained fabric in the north of this image to the suburban social deserts that we're now seeing as a consequence. And so there was an enormous amount of research done. Now, interestingly, as an urban design plan, the research really did concentrate on roads and started to look at, the fabric of systems and movement systems throughout the city. And that was supported by, a visual preference survey. And again, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out that this is a much more beautiful sort of consequence and place that you'd want to be than this. But yet, this is the sort of thing that we're building. This as Carlos again showed, Sirius Road, there's nothing exciting. There's nothing valuable. There's nothing that you would want to take your visitor from out of town to walk along Sirius Road and say, hey, how cool is this environment? And yet, for some reason, we allow that to be, a part of the patterns that we've established. So, what it did was start to say, well, how can we claim back the street and think about it not just for cars, but also for people, and thinking about the public realm, what sort of amenity are we providing, and starting to set some guidelines and regulations for not just that, but, when you think about health and wellness, what do you want to do? You want to be able to allow children the ability to walk or ride their bike to and from school. I did it when I was a kid, so why can't we do it now? And how is it okay to have let that go? So I think bringing back some of those fundamental community building aspects are really super important. But then the final point I wanted to make about this plan was, how is it that we get to a situation where plans, an enormous amount of effort is undertaken, an enormous amount of outreach, and yet if they're not given teeth, that they end up, sitting on shelves. And so the thing that concerned me when I looked at this, when we talked about, or one of the recommendations was that there should be flexibility in interpretation. How could that be okay? If we're trying to sort of really push toward an outcome, and yet we allow a loophole that allows people to say, well, let's be flexible in the way that we interpret this. So the guidelines or the standards that we're setting up, have the ability for interpretation. Secondly, well, where and how does it fit within other documents? And again, Carlos talked about the comprehensive plan, or this actually predated the 1999 general plan, but the comprehensive plan was the parallel at that time. And it says that the guidelines may require amendments. It's not explicit in saying that, well, let's make this work. If this is valuable to us, then let's enable it with actions, and exactly the same for the land use regulation. So that was sort of an interesting sort of prelude, to 20 years ago. What were we thinking about planning and urban design at those sorts of times? And a lot of water has passed under the bridge between, to get us here. So then moving fast forward, over 20 years, let's look at this 2017 Land Use and Urban Design Plan. Now, this was not adopted. But there's amazingly interesting stuff in here. So really the intention was to reflect the changing demographics and economic conditions in the community that then tied back to the goals that were established in the general plan. So it was actually saying, well, how have we changed and what are the things that we need to do differently to make sure that we are sort of recognizing and respecting those values. I think the thing that I'm a landscape architect, urban designer, so I'm always interested in understanding the natural environment. I think it's really, really fundamentally important. No time more so than today when we were dealing with this global pandemic, and who would have anticipated that we're here. But if we look after the environment, if we look after the world that's around us, whether it's our natural fauna and natural flora, our water and our systems, then we have a much better chance of creating a sustainable and resilient community. But the thing that struck me about this was fascinating. You know, we think of cities as being fairly fixed entities, but there's a lot of fluidity. If we look at this map, it talks about population change between 2000 and 2015. The pink shows, in order of sort of intensity, where population has reduced in that period of time, right, over 15 years. And then where has that population gone? And so you start to ask the question, well, what are we doing to either incentivize or de-incentivize people moving to the edges rather than in the middle? Is it just cost? Is it availability of different housing types? Is the family module changing such that we no longer want to live in particular housing types? And so understanding those demographics is really super important. And then over and above that, starting to think about density. Where are the more concentrated areas of density? And you, guess what? You can see it around Airport Road and Sirius Road as well. And so, and yet, we're starting to see, certainly, as we probably know, these lower density areas around the perimeter of our city. What really struck me as really interesting here is that, this was the population, senior population aged over 65 in 2010. Well, guess what? We're getting older. And, where you're seeing this, less than 10% population, it doesn't exist. So we're an aging community as overall. And then equally importantly, linking age to income to ethnicity. So and to me, this is really important in understanding, well, where do you need to provide community services, whether they're healthcare facilities or, schools, education? Well, you're not going to put them in places that have a predominant, you probably put healthcare in areas where either you have low income or you have an aging population, but you're not going to put schools in areas of aging population. So to me, this was a really instructive sort of diagram. But then equally, where are the distribution of centers and corridors? Well, surprisingly, you would normally think that you would place centers at the heart of the community. Think about the cornerstone of how we build our communities. Ideally, you cluster schools and community services and retail within a walkable core of a neighborhood or a district. What we're seeing here is we've got employment centers that are in purple, with retail that is in red, that are clustered again along these corridors. And so what that means is we've established a system that is becoming ever more reliant on the automobile. So if we zoom back to 1993 and you ask the question, well, why is it that we are allowing the plans to evolve in these particular ways? Well, here's the answer. It's through our zoning. The zoning actually controls where and how we push and establish our land uses around the city. And what that means is Sirius Road and, over the next 10 years, Carlos will probably want to turn from a 6-lane plus road to an 8-lane plus road or a 10-lane plus road, unless we change the land use fabric that allows for people to live and work and recreate and shop and, learn within, a common area or within a reasonable area. The alternative is if you don't do that. The second zoning code that was established in this country was in New York City. That was in 1916. And they established a very comprehensive transit network, the subway, to allow for people to move around. So unless you make those same sort of investments here, based on the demographics, based on the zoning code and other things, then you're going to end up really just supporting those corridor movements. And so the takeaway when I think about this, and the second one point I didn't make is the 2017 plan actually had a fairly extensive outreach process, as they both did. But But really, you know, to underline the point that Miguel and Subi made earlier is really to engage meaningfully for equity and inclusion. That's so fundamentally important, particularly equity today when we see the things that are happening in this country. To focus on people and measurable outcomes. Why do we do a plan? Well, we don't do a plan for the plan's purpose. We do it for an outcome. And the outcome isn't just to build roads and houses and other things. It's to do it for people so that people are really enabled and are able to achieve their fullest income, to balance incentives and deterrence. So understanding that codes and regulation will stop you doing things. But who does the most development that we see in our cities? Well, it's the development community. So how do we incentivize those to do the right things that are aligned with our values? To equip them with a clear purpose and implementation teeth. Don't do plans that have loopholes or outs because you're doing an injustice to that. Equip with a clear purpose, and then to provide a clear pathway for government action and investment. So do we want to make another 2 lanes on Sorias Road, or is it time to think about other ways to move around our cities? So with that, let's open it up, or back to you, Gayla, or Lisa, and we'll see where we can take this conversation.
Thank you. Thanks, Andrew. Now, Anthony is going to introduce Lisa.
Sure, it is my privilege to introduce Lisa Gavioli-Roach, who is the City of Santa Fe's Historic Preservation Manager. Lisa is a planner, a preservationist, and an anthropologist, and a member of our ReVisioning history team that is working on these events. Lisa's going to moderate tonight's discussion. And that means that Lisa's going to start by initiating some discussion with the panel, and then incorporate your questions as we go along. So I really encourage everybody to continue to use the Q&A button. And we already have a few questions in the queue. Please fire away as you're thinking about these presentations and as the discussion progresses. Take it away, Lisa, and panelists.
Thanks so much, Anthony. Are we on gallery view or is it spotlighted? Just a question. Hopefully we're on gallery view. Thank you so much for your presentations. Those are fantastic, fantastic overviews and specific investigations of different aspects of planning in Santa Fe. I'll do a little bit of recapping as we go, but I think to begin the discussion, one thing that comes to mind in Gayla's initial question of why don't our outcomes match our values and how do we get the city that we want? It struck me, especially in hearing particularly Subi's presentation and Miguel's presentation and moving on to really is a thread that they ran through all, is that planning really begins with community engagement. And our built environment will only ever be as good as our plans, and our plans will only ever be as good as our process of engaging with the community. So my first question to the panel is, how can we as planners and community organizers and architects and designers engage more meaningfully with the community? How does this relate to ownership of the process potentially, and what other models are possible than the traditional ones that we've really been employing over the last 20, 50, 70 years. I mean, I want to mention that as Miguel indicated, how can we use the planning process to inspire and to empower and to cultivate leadership, especially in our youth population? And how can we use the process to inspire creativity that stems from our diversity as a community? So I'll open that up for discussion. Maybe Miguel wants to begin.
Thank you, I will.
Well, it looks like we've got two.
So I truly, believe in community-driven development, right? And we did a little small project back a year ago, I think it was, maybe longer already. Christy Scarpetti, that's part of the team, and students at Capitol High School. And it was a planning game that we did with them. where they could talk about their own communities, where they live now, compare that to where they lived in wherever it was that they were from, Mexico, Guatemala, El Salvador, wherever, and sort of do the half a mile circle around home, and to tell the story about what they could access walking half a mile in any direction from their home. And when they looked at their communities where they had come from, many of which don't have either good zoning or enforced zoning, they could pretty much access everything that they needed within a few blocks of the house, right? A place to play, a school, a park, food, a place to hang out with their friends, jobs, etc., clinics, all these things. And these are in countries that our current president would call, well, you know what he's called them. And then when we looked at their neighborhoods here, and these are primarily neighborhoods north of Airport Road, they couldn't, unless they live right on Airport Road, they pretty much couldn't access anything walking half a mile, right? So as we talked about this, and we talked about why, and we talked about planning, we talked about how policies and things get decided, and then they presented at City Council, and the mayor and some of the city councilors were there, and they got really excited about being able to take those ideas and run with them. And the same thing happened in 2012 when we did the Healthy Communities work. The same thing is happening right now with the Teen Center. The difference with the Teen Center, which is not just a teen center, it's a multi-purpose, multi-generational center, is that it's not just community saying this is what we would like to see. There's something on the other side saying we have some funding, and there's some folks there saying, and we're going to make sure that it gets done. So the bridge, it has to be built from both sides. We can support skills, and capacity building. We can support engagement. We can bring folks together around a kitchen table. Maybe not right now, but we can bring folks together virtually around the virtual cocina, right? But there has to be something on the other side. There has to be neighborhood planning. There has to be long-range planning. There has to be investment. There has to be integrated community development opportunities, right? Not just sort of piecemeal kinds of things. And somebody, folks at the city have to be looking for opportunities to invest in community-driven planning. The opportunity zones, for example, is one such an opportunity, right? Depending on what happens with that, depending on how it develops, these could be great opportunities for community for community reinvestment, right? For partnership agreements, for if this investment is going here, a certain percentage is going to go to the surrounding communities. The Midtown is another example. There's lots of concerns around what will happen with the areas around the Midtown campus, as well as what may materialize there. But there have to be some.
Well, it looks like we may have lost your sound, Miguel. Let's see if I can unmute you. There. Maybe you could just restate that last thing you said, because we really want to hear it. Or maybe we still can't hear you. There we are. Thank you, Miguel. So I want to pick up on something that you just said, or unless someone else from the panel has more to offer about this idea. How do we improve and rethink community engagement? Subi, would you like to respond?
Yes, a couple of different things that Miguel said that I was struck by. One of our biggest failings, of course, that we all talked about and around was Cerrillos Road. Cerrillos Road is actually governed by the highway department. And so, of course, it acts as a highway. And back in the 1980s, when the city of Santa Fe first bought the first buses for people who couldn't afford cars, we talked about a central lane for buses and passageways where people could walk out to the buses and catch the bus and ride quickly through the traffic. And the highway department rejected it because they were focused on cars and gasoline and things of that sort. So I think one of the creative things might be, what if in the future we look at how we can still get funding from the highway department, but take back over those regulatory controls and start to make it more accessible for us. and support more mass transit and things of that sort. The other thing I'm intrigued by is that the oral history of Santa Fe. When I came in 1984, I would write people letters because I came from Austin, Texas, Santa Fe, where you wrote people letters. And I wouldn't hear anything. And so I'd go downtown and with no notice, I'd show up at their desk. And they didn't even have to pick up the letter. They wanted to talk to me. They wanted to have a conversation. And it's been interesting to watch Santa Fe go from a very strong oral community back into a written community. And I think this moment in time with these Zoom meetings is oral again. So it's exciting. What can we do to further that and advance that in a lot of ways?
And Lisa, I just want to pick up on Miguel and where he was talking about engaging the community. I think we have to start with some basic fundamentals. The community is smart, number one. Number two, the community own our cities, right? We are just stewards, and no one has complete ownership over the decisions that get made or how our cities grow and move. And comprehensive engagement is really important and at a level where people understand fully what the trade-offs are. Going back to Carlos's point, we are working on a project here in Denver at the moment that's a 155-acre site that a group of broader sort of municipal constituents want to see it as a park. But then the local community, which have been underserved, they're a food desert, they're concerned about gentrification, are sort of weighed into the competition. We developed a game where people could come together and understand what the trade-offs are. That if a developer is responsible for delivering the ultimate solution, then how do you prioritize affordable housing, access to a grocery store, training for young people to be able and incubate businesses in the local area? And if people are bought in to understand the complexity of these things, they will help find the solutions. And I think we need to respect the role that they can and should play in elevating their values. And there are smart ways to do that.
I want to continue with that a little bit. There's roles for different groups to play. The community, I think, has the largest role. City government, which is not the entire city, but city government ideally should take kind of a facilitative role, to take a role where it's able to use its resources to hold space, to create meetings, to pay for some of this engagement that a lot of times is reliant on nonprofits. The city has not been really successful in engaging in those activities recently. The city hasn't really invested as much as I think some people want. Things have been changing. I know that there are a lot of staff that want to be working more on community-based type planning, but for now, a large part of it is making sure that the different community groups, stakeholder groups, activist groups, and nonprofits are really having good dialogue and engagement to really understand how these things work. There's a lot of people that are listening in on this call that are experts in that very kind of activity.
Let's hear from them.
Yes, please submit questions. We're getting some excellent questions from the audience, and then perhaps I'll move to an audience question at this moment. Let's see. Who am I gonna highlight? So I think so we have a question from Sean Evans for Andrew. He says, Andrew, you mentioned being an outsider. Who's from here? Who has the right to speak for Santa Fe? These are questions and accusations we've been hearing a lot in the last week as the struggle to control monuments and memory finds its way into New Mexico. From my perspective, we're lucky to have you, someone with as wide an experience as you have and are involved in the future of Midtown. How can your experiences help Santa Feans, both those who have been here for generations and those who have just arrived, understand the possibilities for Midtown that are as respectful of our different histories as they are respectful of our shared future?
That's a great question. Thanks, Sean. how do I answer that? You know, okay, so let me do, there are 2 points I want to make. The first one is, as an outsider, I'm unencumbered by things. Like I moved here with my family from Australia in 2001, in October, 1st of October. And in Thanksgiving, we did our first family road trip and we drove to Santa Fe and we knew straight away we were in somewhere incredibly different, right? This was nowhere like anywhere in Australia or anywhere in the United States for that matter. And it's the merging of cultures as well as, you know, socioeconomics. You've got people from all walks of life. And as an outsider, that is a fascinating and a really valuable commodity, right? We think about cities that, like New York, for instance, that are becoming exclusionary of people, you know, of all walks of life or all socioeconomic circumstances to be able to live there. So you've got something really special, and being able to really promote that diversity and to nurture every element of that is super important. If I look to Santa Fe Midtown, I think it's a fascinating opportunity. It is change. And I think managing that change in a way that aligns with the values is super important. But the thing that struck me about Midtown is it's not the plan. There is no physical plan at this point in time. It is the partnerships that have been established. The fact that 2 out-of-town developers, both from Dallas, Sienda and KDC, have created a development partnership. But what they also did is reached out to University of New Mexico, Santa Fe Community College, 3 housing entities that can address affordable housing, attainable housing, and market rate housing. Although they'd argue that everything is affordable to someone, right, depending on your income and circumstances and needs. They've partnered with YouthWorks, who are about capacity building and helping youth find a path and opportunity, financial opportunity. So they've brought together a constituency that, and a film studio. Right? And the really interesting part of that is that University of New Mexico and Santa Fe Community College want to partner with the film studio to be able to train people either to become film editors or the best boy or the gaffer or the stage and set design builders. So what they're doing is actually developing an economic sort of engine and a community of capacity of people who can live there, work there, shop there, play there, recreate there, and it's for everyone. And I find that really fascinating. Now it will have an impact on the adjacent neighborhoods. Just how that is structured is going to be really interesting. And I guess the challenge will be to turn that into a positive impact on the adjacent communities rather than a negative. And so, you know, it's got these amazing building blocks that in my mind set it up for success. If it was just a group of developers who were going to sell land, then that wouldn't be the case. And I'd have more, you know, major concerns. But they do care about sustainability. They care about community. They being all of these partners, they care about health and wellness. Well, there is a clinic there as well. I'm sorry, St. Krista, I can't recall the name now. But anyway, so that's my answer. The fact that it takes a village and they're building the village to be able to address this and move it forward.
Thanks, Andrew. Does anyone else have thoughts to offer regarding that question, which really has to do with how we, I mean, Sean was speaking about respecting our different histories as we hold different histories in the same level of respect as we do our shared future. Miguel, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, over the years, one of the groups I worked with, we've brought, I don't know, probably about 30 tours from Australia of primarily educators, but lots of parents and school leaders and what have you. And they love coming here because it is so different. But once here, and once they engage in conversations with indigenous communities, with Native New Mexican, Chicanos, etc., they find, and they hear the stories, they find that it's not that different under the surface. right? And in terms of how, so how do you get to who can speak and who can represent or what have you? Part of what's come out of a lot of those conversations that until you pull
We might be having some internet connectivity problems with Miguel. Perhaps he can finish his thought in just a moment. Oh, maybe.
Pardon me?
No, you're back. Continue.
And that until you pull back the veil on those agreements, right? And that's the conversation that the mayor is proposing, that we've, everybody's been proposing for years, but he's proposing it now, that we have some real truth and reconciliation conversations. Until that kind of work happens, it's really going to be difficult to answer these other questions, because it's contested terrain, it's contested land, right? The history of this place is a history of colonization, of domination, of invasion, etc. And until those kinds of things get clarified some, in all of this, nobody is speaking for the land, right? And the issue of land and how it gets stewarded, owned or taken care of or what have you, is primal for both Native and Chicano populations in New Mexico. And yet that hasn't been a part of the conversation. The opportunity around Midtown, from a different perspective, it looks like there's been a lot of intentional distancing of people so that they wouldn't participate, so that they wouldn't be engaged, because this is the way we see it from the community, right? That there was some collaboration, some kind of plan, so, and they wanted to make sure all the ducks were in a row before there was real community engagement. And then we end up just responding to what everybody else is proposing, right? Which isn't community engagement. That's gallery walks, right? To some other people's plans. And, so the question around Midtown is who was left out, not necessarily who's at the table, but who was left out, and who designed the table in the first place. I think there's still some possibilities there, but it doesn't look real promising.
Thank you, Miguel, and thank you, Andrew. I'm going to, on that note, continue on with another question from our attendees. This question comes from Marian Diddy. She says, moving forward in our approach to urban planning and neighborhood engagement, how do we acknowledge current and historical trauma in communities, whether it's trauma from not being heard, from displacement, disinvestment, increased crime, police brutality, and violence? How do you navigate dealing with community trauma in your planning practice, and what role can planners play in addressing trauma? That's a tough one. Who wants to touch it?
I'll start.
Okay.
Not that I know the answer, because I don't know the answer, but I did listen to some of the city council meeting last night where people were expressing their opinions about the how they felt about the obelisk coming down or not coming down, or the Vargas, and so I learned a lot about just listening. I didn't hear all of the talks, but the one that struck me the most was by a woman who grew up here and acknowledged the pain of the displacement. And I don't know if she even said what culture she's from, but what she did for me was to talk about how we heal the trauma with our children and how we create opportunities for people to heal. And it started with the kids. It is land use in some ways, because the land use is almost the product of the trauma. And so how do you back up and talk about that kind of displacement and the things that have happened over the years? And it seemed to me more of a social question. I mean, I think Miguel talked about the mayor's, whatever he's calling it, where people can, the reconciliation, or I don't know if that's the right word, but that's what I got, is that, oh, this is beyond land use. I mean, yeah, land use can help make it better, or it can help do no harm, I guess, is maybe the way that I could see that at that moment when she was talking. So that's my 2 cents.
If I could, I mean, this is a tough question and a tough issue. My sense, again, I can talk freely as an outsider, sort of, although I've lived here for 19 years, so maybe I'm not. I see it more as a symptom. I see it more as a symptom than a cause. There are some underlying systemic issues that we have to address. One of the most powerful projects I worked on was developing a master plan for the city of Kigali in Rwanda, and it was 8 years after the genocide. Genocide was created as a result of land ownership and displacement, who had things and who did not have things, who was included within the community versus who was excluded. And this speaks a little to Miguel's comment about who owns the table or who is invited to the table. And so there are, you know, providing the ability, I mean, if we think about the Maslow's like hierarchy of need, shelter comes at the top, and we all need that as a fundamental right. Food, security, education, jobs, employment. There are some systemic sort of issues that we as a general community have to address. Now, land use is a part of that, and land use can actually help move the chess pieces across the board. But we clearly need to make sure that we are being inclusive and equitable. And so I think equity is an underlying part of the way that we think about planning. And I think we need to elevate that to the top, not just health and wellness, but inclusion and equity. And if we do that in a meaningful way and we include people in the conversation, then we'll be in a much better place. But until we have that conversation, we'll never solve the problem, and statues will come down or go up, and they're symbols of a greater underlying problem.
If I can jump in here for a minute.
Yeah.
I think we have to be real careful when we talk about these things, because I think the question really is how do we stop re-traumatizing, not how do we help people with their trauma, right? Our communities, our families, our cultures, etc. We can find ways to heal, right? And you know, if there's too much focus on, you know, these pobrecitos all traumatized, I mean, you know, that's a growth industry. There's people writing grants right now to figure out how they're going to come and help all of our, you know, pobrecito little brown kids that have been traumatized by, you know, COVID-19 and what have you. That's not what we need. We need the space to be and the resources to be able to heal ourselves, and we need the systems to stop re-traumatizing. So that becomes the question, right? Out of the truth and reconciliation conversations, are people willing to hear what things, daily practices, laws, ordinances, new traditions that have been embedded and made Santa Fe, et cetera. If people are willing to honestly hear what kinds of things are traumatizing and re-traumatizing on a regular basis, then it allows for folks to be able to do their own healing. And until that happens, we can't move forward, right? If everybody, you know, if the agreements, you know, as I was talking earlier, are that, you know, we're all free to traumatize others if we have the power to do that. And until, you know, that changes, you know, we just sort of keep going forward and we keep saying we're, you know, a happy tricultural state, and look at the postcards and come visit us and everything will be fine, right?
I think pulling off of that is where we're investing. We have so far, okay, so we haven't built a lot of trust between, especially I see the government and the community, the city as a whole. There hasn't been a lot of trust. There hasn't been enough relationship building. But expanding into that, Miguel, I think you're absolutely right. Kind of how do you kind of provide the space for people to be able to heal themselves? We need to invest in our people. We need to invest in our community. Right now, we are investing for the last kind of 50 years. We've spent a lot of time building regulatory codes, regulatory systems. We built a lot of laws, and we are very invested in those laws. But those, when we're only invested in that, we're not invested in the community. We're not invested in people. We're not empowering, and we're not bringing people to the table. We're not rethinking about whether those laws are actually still serving the people that they're supposed to be. But until we actually invest in that as a community, as a city, from different nonprofits, as individuals, we're not actually going to be able to change that. And I think that is something where not having housing excludes so many people from the city. 53% of the workforce can't vote in our elections because they don't live in the city. Yeah.
I think that's a really good point, Carlos. And if I could just follow up from those comments with another question. Carlos, you've spoken of the difficulty of translating values into technical regulations, and this relationship between values and regulations, I think, is worth exploring a little bit more. If we see planning documents as policy documents that are implemented through regulations, through programs of the government, I guess my question goes back to perhaps the comments that you made in our intro session, which is really, is the sterilization of our built environment inherent in the regulatory process, which has historically relied upon standardization? And how does this operate to inhibit the, as you call it, the social chaos that is a prerequisite in many ways for the creativity and continuation of a living culture and community expression? So I wonder if, Carlos, you could pick that up and say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so what Lisa was getting at a little bit was, I was talking about how the regulations that we've invested in, the law enforcement types that we've invested in, have sometimes lead to a sterilization of our community, a sterilization of our built environment, rather than recognizing social systems as being forests of life and chaos. Regulations don't have to sterilize, but if we are over-regulating, they will. And that's really where we have to be careful in how we regulate. Are we regulating in a way that's equitable? Are we regulating in a way that produces housing, affordable housing? Are we regulating in a way that produces creativity? Or are we regulating in a way that sterilizes, that removes people's voices, that removes opportunities to participate in the community? And so I think it's hard to kind of understand which regulations actually do work and don't work. That's what the democratic process is supposed to be. That's what participatory, community-based facilitative planning is supposed to be, is really understanding those values. Miguel was talking a bunch about how when he was interviewing youth, we figured out so many different things that we didn't understand before. We thought we had this, we thought we had this figured out, but by actually engaging in proper ways, we understood that the youth wanted something different for their spaces. And in a similar way, I think we have to approach regulations cautiously, creatively, critically, to understand what is and is not working.
And one of those would be to have regulations to define the lungs of the community, the trees, the forest of the community. When we were working with citizens, one of the reasons why they were willing to do the kind of density we were showing on the Northwest Quadrant was because for every 1 acre that was developed, there were 5 acres that were protected so that there'd continue to be a forest. And talked about, you know, highway crossings over 599, not only to provide for cars, but also for animals, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, there have been discussions about studying the community forest, which, you know, above the national forest is up above us. What about our community forest? And that's ultimately what keeps us calm, is that relationship to nature. And when, you know, you drive between here and Albuquerque today, as I was doing just that, I said, thank God for the Native American community, because they believe in protecting the land and recognize the healing nature of the land rather than it all being buildings. So I do think that studying that as deeply as we study sidewalks and streets and heights of buildings would help us all in having better relationships with each other.
I think that's a really good point, Subi, to really take this moment in which we're really being called to become curious about the very systems and processes that we've relied upon to plan for the future for the past, you know, I think the 20th century model of planning has really influenced our outcomes and our regulations and our built environment, and to really ask ourselves how these have shaped and have these built-in structural biases towards exclusion of certain socioeconomic classes, races, ethnicities, whole segments of our community, whole segments of our environment. And as Andrew highlighted, planning has changed, and our systems began with a certain set of values, and those values and priorities have changed, but our regulations and our planning documents have not caught up to that. So I wonder if any of you have thoughts or ideas about how we can begin to do that self-examination and perhaps change the whole structure of how planning takes place. I'm talking about ownership, I'm talking about collaboration, I'm talking about building partnerships with the community to do this work. And I obviously have my own personal bent on this, but I would love to hear more, both from questions from the audience and from the panel.
Could I have a quick stab at that, Lisa? You know, it's sort of just thinking about human nature. I was, and this is going to sound perverted, but I was really heartened, you know, in 2009, 2010, we were in the grips of this great recession. Oil was trading at $140 a barrel. And people started to rethink, do I need that second SUV or that big truck, or, you know, that gets 12 miles a gallon? Maybe I'll get a bicycle, and maybe I'll take transit. And, you know, what we started to see over a 12-month period was the automotive industry was starting to change its offering to society, and smaller cars, more sort of fuel efficient cars, we started to see more of. Prius and others, and it just killed me when oil came back below $100 a barrel, and now it's trading below 30 or below 20, whatever it is. So, you know, it was through the pain that was created that allowed people to think about embracing change, and we can't expect government or others to do it independent of us, and which is the second point I wanted to make is where we are today, right? There are two things that are happening. I never believed in my lifetime that we would live through a pandemic. You know, it is science fiction. It is, you know, still I walk out the door and scratch my head and think, is this real? However, what we're starting to see are two things happening. The first is we've got this racial disparity that we're seeing starting to emerge, whether it's pulling down statues or whether it's saying it's not okay to live this way anymore. At the same time as we are being forced to socially distance. And we're starting to rethink our streets. Milan has repurposed 35 kilometers of streets to become pedestrian bicycle only. The city of Bristol in the United Kingdom has converted its whole downtown to be walkable, places to live, places that are people oriented. And so, you know, unfortunately human nature, you know, at least as far as I can tell, will sort of respond when we get to this breaking point. We are at one of those most fundamental breaking points in our lifetimes, in, you know, generations. We're reliving the Spanish flu of 1918. We're reliving the Great Depression of the 1930s. We're reliving the race riots of 1968. All of those pieces come together. I don't think we've got any choice but to change and to question and to sort of shuffle the deck, if you like, in terms of how we are living and what are the consequences of where we've arrived at today. And that's sort of a hopeful answer, I think.
No, I mean, I happen to agree with you. I tend to feel that this discomfort that we're all experiencing worldwide and in our community in specific ways is perhaps the condition in which real change has an opportunity to take root. And that I think is human nature. It's in some ways that's sort of a principle of the world.
And I forgot to mention climate change. I'm sorry, that builds on part of your point too, Steve.
Well, on that note, I think it might be a good opportunity to transition into some of the audience questions that we have on sustainability. Well, let's see, we have a number of good ones. Let's see, so we have a question from Devendra Contractor. Are there any examples where conventional form-based functional zoning is replaced by value-based codes? As an example, could sustainability and community values be used to determine density and height? It's this idea that maybe we can create new systems of regulating, new systems of zoning and creation of codes. Does anyone have thoughts on that?
I could add to that question perhaps. It's really decentralizing the planning process that we use in cities, and so that it does become smaller and smaller units of neighbors that are using their own values to understand and design their cities and design their neighborhoods. The Happy City book that Charles Montgomery, that Andrew talked about when I first met him, is really interesting in that people really took control of their places and transformed their neighborhoods so that they really did operate as a neighborhood and not just a pass-through suburb into downtown Portland, for instance. So it could happen, but it would have to be some sort of decentralized collaboration with the government, I would imagine.
We can also start to use systems like movies. I mean, I've been watching feature films since the 1980s, and I'm intrigued that most of them are disaster films. And there aren't films showing great forests and great decentralized. And so, you know, we're still relying on these sort of old-fashioned paper documents where we're drawing plans. And so maybe it is starting to use new systems like doing videos and doing movies and listening to people talking like we're doing now, and then taking those ideas and carrying it even further so we start to use the new possibilities as opposed to the old planning systems. But there's a billion of the plagues and the viruses in the movies, and so people are adaptable. They're used to it. They've seen it in the movie theaters for decades. So what can we do to give them new ideas and new concepts?
And I think we could move more towards form-based rather than prescriptive code. The nice thing with that is that sometimes you could get administrative efficiency. So again, the hard part is that right now we've got such a complicated code that requires so much administrative time. It's very, very expensive to administer, to enforce. It's a really large project. Trying to make kind of specific zones reflective of sustainability and community values can be difficult. I think that could sometimes, there's a potential to raise the administrative burden on that. But you could always look at the existing regulations that we have and kind of ask, is this accomplishing environmental sustainability? Is this accomplishing equity? Is this accomplishing community values? But then again, the hard part is, which values do we care about? Are we trying to prioritize valuing the existing residents or new residents that may arrive? Are we trying to evaluate children and youth? Or are we trying to evaluate our elders? There's very different values in how we think about where regulations can go. And so kind of getting more certainty on what that is and prioritizing what's important is kind of the start of it, in my mind.
And Carlos, that sort of speaks to something a point that you brought up in your presentation, and that we cannot prioritize all values that are expressed during a planning process. And what is it we're willing to give up?
What if we start to do it neighborhood by neighborhood instead of this large, overview by the elite planners? And that's what a lot of the big cities do, is they let the neighborhoods do their own plans.
So is it a matter of scale?
Mm-hmm.
Could I offer? Go ahead.
I was just going to say, the hard part is, okay, so one, what are we willing to be, what kind of discomfort are we willing to absorb? to accept, right? We have to accept some type of discomfort. It's either going to be a lack of affordable housing or it's going to be, you know, something else. But then the second part, I forget. Andrew, maybe you should go. That's correct.
Well, I just wanted to offer I wanted to be the naysayer here, right? You know, you know, all things are not bright and beautiful. And if we offer too much authority at a local level, there's this little thing called NIMBYism, where people don't want change. People self-protect what they have and are not prepared to accept the trade-off. A great example of this in San Francisco, where the housing rates are through the roof. There was a new regulation established by the city that required or allowed density to occur around like rail stations, transit stations. Now, remember that transit costs a lot of money, and that it makes sense to be able to build density around those places that can open up affordability. And the local residents complained and actually overturned that regulation with support of the Sierra Club, which just surprised me, it staggered me. And so self-interest in that instance overrode the common good, right? So let's not fool ourselves that, you know, really engaging at that sort of granular level is going to be a fix-all, because it might just unearth as many other problems as
I'd like to thank you, Andrew. I think that's a good counterpoint. I'd like to hear what Miguel has to say about this particular issue with his experience in working at the neighborhood scale and around the kitchen table.
Yeah, thank you. I think we do have to have more of that, right? More neighborhood-based, community-based, people-driven planning and development. However, it can't just be, you know, here's a flip chart, here's some markers, go at it, right? We have to invest in what we at our organization call civic infrastructure. And that's something, you know, when we talk about disinvestment, that's one of the things that we as a society we starved it, right? I mean, I mentioned as we were planning today's conversation that I grew up in Chicago, and every child, every kid in school back then had a copy of the Chicago plan, the Burnham plan, right?
Miguel, I'm wondering if you turn off your video, if your audio wouldn't be more consistent.
City of Chicago, and we're a community of 50 different ethnicities at least, right? That didn't speak to each other that much, but we all had sort of a common experience going through that. That stopped in the mid 60s. But that's something I think that we can do here locally. If we invest in organizing and civic infrastructure at the community level, working with young people at the 2 high schools, at the middle schools, saying, you know, the future of this city is up to you. You're going to design it, you're going to plan it, we're going to support you, invest it, build the skills that you need, etc. You'll get less NIMBYism, you'll get more common language across communities, right? For people to be able to, you know, and the lack of civic infrastructure and civic consciousness, it's not just among, say, you know, people are thinking of the immigrants, the Spanish speakers, the poorer populations. No, those folks that are the first to say down in my neighborhood, they have a lack of civic consciousness and awareness, right? All they know is that I don't want that thing next to my house because they don't take any time to see the impact of, you know, we had this conversation, for example, when the school district was proposing closing schools. They were proposing closing schools in exactly the same neighborhoods that kept saying that they didn't want affordable housing, right? And we mentioned this to the city councilors and some of the community members, like you're closing your school because you decided you didn't want families in your neighborhood, right? So if we have that kind of capacity building and education and awareness and have young people drive this more, I think that we'll make some progress. As our brother from Australia mentioned, you know, it's not going to be perfect, but what we have right now is a disaster.
I love this idea of civic infrastructure that you talk about, Miguel. It strikes me that the planning process itself creates plans, creates the built environment, but it also is a force that can generate community, that can bring people together it can engender feelings of belonging and safety and creativity and celebration, as you mentioned. So just a little reflection there. Let's see. Shall we move on to? We're running close to time, so I'm going to turn back to questions from our audience. Maybe just time for a couple more questions. Let's see. So I have a question from JD Scott. How should community-based planners and the broader design community approach community desires that are known to be harmful or dangerous to future generations? For instance, it is known that reliance on cars is inherently unsustainable in many ways, and shouldn't we be able to advocate for solutions that are better in the long term, even if they violate community desires in the present? This is a really interesting question, sort of that speaking to that mismatch or negotiation of values that happens within the planning process.
I'm going to answer it in an odd way. You know, everyone sits and talks about how do you deal with overpopulation on the planet. Well, interestingly, the latest studies show that the most successful issue is that you educate women. You're not talking about whether or not they have babies. You just teach them about the world. They go to colleges, they go to universities, they go to high schools, and they don't produce as many babies. And so maybe it is the education of the community about how they can participate and encourage their participation, and then we'll find new discoveries we might not have thought of before. And so it isn't, it can often be very surprising where those answers come from, as Miguel's studies show.
But is it just a one-way flow of information, this idea of educating the community? To me, it strikes me that there is as much to learn in both directions as there is a need to educate and inform.
And I think that's part of the kind of facilitative model, is that you want to bring information out to create good debate. Because again, you know, us standing up here trying to be, you know, experts on this situation, we can help kind of provide information. We could ask questions. We are not the decision makers, and we shouldn't be. That is a democratic process. It should be the entire community that is making these decisions. But I think it, exactly as Sibi was saying, kind of bringing out information is what's important. So juxtaposing. This is the cost of this value that we have. This is the cost of this regulation we have. If we the cost of commuting, of 53% of the workers commuting into Santa Fe was evaluated in 2007 as being $300 million to the Santa Fe economy, right?
Wow.
I can't, you know, it's not my job, it's not my right to say what the solution necessarily is. I could give ideas, I could give data, but eventually that is a democratic process that has to happen. Our water usage has gone down despite increasing population. So are there concerns about water? Absolutely. But so far we haven't been running out of water in the last 10 or 20 years. We've actually been reducing our water usage despite increasing population. That's a good data point to know. That helps inform the debate. It helps facilitate debate. It helps create more engaging debate, but it's not creating the solutions or the answers that have to happen there. And so I think you just have to be careful about not having this kind of paternalistic approach about knowing better than others on some of these things, because I mean that's kind of what we have to rely on in a democratic society. But it is difficult.
Thank goodness.
No easy answers here. I'm going to follow up with another question from the audience, and then we'll probably have to transition towards wrapping up because we're closing in on that 2-hour mark. We have a question from Rick Schrader. It says, we need a tool for youth and adults by extension to do community-based decentralized data generation on the spaces in their communities and how to model possible futures. How can we develop this? I wonder if anyone has ideas about that.
I'm going to throw this to Miguel first, and then I don't know, Andrew might have some good ideas from some of his experiences too.
Earlier I mentioned about the need to do integrated community development. I think we need to do integrative planning also. There's, and I keep saying the schools, because there's opportunities I think that we have to carve out within the education system for these things. In other words, there's all this emphasis, for example, on STEM, or we keep talking about how little our students are progressing in math, right? I think it would be a lot more exciting for them if they were looking at real life projects and real life challenges and real life opportunities to better their world in the process of learning math, or in the process of doing STEM work, classes or what have you, or English, or, science, or whatever it is. I think
it looks like we've lost him again. What I love about Miguel's approach, and this, these are my words, not his, is that by on youth engagement. Oh, Miguel's back. Please continue.
Oh, sorry.
Please do. No.
I was mentioning Place It, right, and things like that, which are participatory games and experiences that people can use to, young people of any age can use to vision. What might our community look like? What, could it, if we move this over here. I remember when I first started taking planning courses way back when, SimCity is what we used.
Yeah.
Right. And, so things like that, I think we can utilize, and that's something that anybody can utilize and see what happens. If we put this road here instead of there, what happens, right? If we close off all the streets to the plaza, what happens, right? And let everybody in town play with it instead of just the folks downtown, right? And maybe save us an hour's worth of city council meeting time, right?
And Miguel, maybe that's the call to action. Maybe that's the thing that we take away, is that we need to get involved in schools. We need to train and teach kids that this is a potential future for them. I'm always perturbed about the lack of diversity in our professions. So let's get active, and we don't expect other people to do it. But
yeah, and I would say it's not just about creating future planners. It's about creating future leaders in our community who feel empowered to engage, who feel like they have a voice, and who feel like they have a say in what the future holds. I love that you brought up SimCity, Miguel, because I can guarantee you that my experience with SimCity in high school is one of the biggest reasons I became a planner ultimately.
When you look at job prospects, because that's one of the things on people's minds, right? In terms of how many engineers, how many scientists, how many teachers, all these things that we're going to need in the region. The thing that's at the very top is project managers. People that can be good civil servants that can manage things in City Hall and at the county level, at the labs, etc. That's the biggest opportunity for employment over the next 20 years, and we're not preparing people for that. That's why we got to bring people from Australia.
Yeah, we got to build that civic infrastructure. Thank you. I want to take a moment, because we are running out of time, to thank all of our panel for really rich discussion. I want to thank our audience for really interesting questions. And I'm going to volley back over to Anthony to wrap up.
Thanks, Lisa. And a huge thank you to our brilliant panelists. It was a really entertaining conversation tonight and really informative. Huge thanks to Subi Bowden, Miguel Acosta, Carlos Gamora, and Andrew Irvine. Thanks too to our Revisioning History team, our host, Gayla Bechtel, our moderator, Lisa Roach, and to Chrissy Scarpiti, who's pulling all the strings digitally behind the scenes. To members of our Friends Board, especially Annette Propository, who makes us look good on our website and with our communications. And speaking of looking good, Robert Innes and Design Corps, thank you for the graphics. And most of all, and most sincerely, we at Friends of Architecture want to thank you, this incredible interdisciplinary audience of architects, planners, designers, developers, builders, creatives, advocates, and citizens. Thank you for being enthusiastic participants in tonight's discussion and in our ongoing events. Thank you for your questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of them, but the Revisioning History series continues. In August, we'll be doing Revisioning Preservation. That's the next one in this season, in this series. That's Thursday, August 27th, with Lisa Roach hosting that one. Coming up even sooner is Pechacucha Volume 7. The theme for this one is Profit. There's an amazing roster of speakers for that one. Please join us for Pechacucha on Wednesday, July 22nd at 6 p.m. There's more information on our website about the event and the speakers, architecturesantafe.org. And before I say goodnight, I just want to remind everybody that Friends is the only organization in Santa Fe with an interdisciplinary focus on design and the built environment. Our events offer opportunities and a forum for this kind of connection that we had tonight, for mutual education. I know I learned a lot, and discussion, ideation, and advocacy. We thank those who've supported us. We thank you for participating. Please continue to support us and support our efforts by making a donation on our website, architecturesantafe.org. Thanks again for being a friend, for joining us tonight, and we'll see you soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thanks.
Thank you.